Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Jonas Nursing and Veterans Healthcare 2022 webinar series. Again, please note that this webinar is being recorded. And thank you for joining us. And as you know, we are the signature program of Jonas Philanthropies. Today's webinar is entitled Healthcare and Justice for Immigrant Children. I am Dr. Althea Hicks. I'm the Grants and Programs Manager for Jonas Nursing and Veterans Healthcare. Our webinar today will be conducted by Ms. Brenda Punske, the Advocacy Director and Senior Level Psychotherapist at Terra Firma, a unique medical legal mental health partnership embedded in Montefiore Bronx Health Collective. And that provides trauma-informed services specifically tailored to unaccompanied immigrant youth and asylum-seeking families. Ms. Punske provides trauma-informed individual, family, and group psychotherapy services and specializes in traumatic stress, complex trauma, attachment, family systems therapy, and acculturation. Her expertise includes conducting psychological evaluations and writing affidavits in support of patients' asylum and other immigration cases, and training medical, legal, and mental health professionals, both nationally and internationally, on best practices when working with unaccompanied immigrant youth and asylum-seeking families. Ms. Punske's experience working with families separated at the border under the zero tolerance policy has been published in the peer-reviewed Journal of Child and Adolescent Trauma. And she has also collaborated with the ACLU's litigation by conducting psychological evaluations of asylum seekers stranded at the border under the Migrant Protection Protocols, or MPP, in Matamoros, Mexico. In addition to her MSW degree from Silver School of Social Work, Brenda holds law degrees from both NYU School of Law, Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico, and worked as a human rights attorney for several years before becoming a social worker. Ms. Punske was also honored with NYU's Global Social Work Award for her outstanding international social justice work and studies. She's also a mediator certified by the New York Peace Institute. Thank you all for joining us today as we begin. As a reminder, please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. And now please welcome Ms. Brenda Punske. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My apologies again. Sometimes the technical things are real hurdles. Okay, so today we're gonna talk about unaccompanied immigrant children and asylum-seeking families, and I'm going to try to explain what our experiences are in our clinic. I'm going to talk about who we are, the work that we do, and what we have learned from this population. Next slide, please. So first, I'm going to talk about who are we talking about when we say unaccompanied immigrant children and asylum-seeking families. Unaccompanied immigrant children are considered those who cross the border to the United States when they are under 18 years old, without lawful immigration status in the US, and without a biological parent or legal guardian who is able to provide custody of them at the time of the apprehension. Now, it's important to note that there are some children, especially, that come either with an aunt or with a sister or with someone that they've been living with for their whole lives, and they are the de facto caregiver, maybe from day one since they were born. But if they are not the legal guardian or the biological parent, they will be considered as if they entered unaccompanied. And that's going to have legal implications later on, which I'm going to talk about a little later. And then adults with children are either parents or legal guardians of those crossing when they're under 18 years old. Next slide, please. So there have been great shifts in immigration starting in the year 2014. There was what's considered a surge in immigration, there were many more unaccompanied immigrant children being apprehended at the border. And now most of unaccompanied immigrant children come from Central America, from what's known as the Northern Triangle, which is Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. There are also children coming from other places in Latin America, some countries in West Africa, but I would say the majority come from these three countries in Central America. Now, we have seen several shifts in immigration, but as you see from fiscal year 2021, it just skyrocketed. And then in fiscal year 2022, which isn't over yet, the numbers that were available from October to March. And as you can see, it's already like the numbers are extremely high, and we expect to see the end of fiscal year 2022 either at the same with the same number or probably much higher than 2022. Next slide, please. And the same happens with families. We're seeing many more families also coming in 2021, 2022. And also, sorry, the reason why we saw so little in 2020 was because of COVID and very strict policies and restrictions for like allowing, rather turning people away. Like people would go to the border and request asylum, and they would tell people that they had to wait in Mexico for there to be space and for different things. So I'm going to talk about unaccompanied immigrant children and asylum-seeking families as a whole, but it's very important to know that even within this population, there's a lot of diversity, like there would be in any population. They have differentiated differences in their identities, in their language, cultural values, rituals, and costumes. They have very different experiences of discrimination, both in their country of origin and in the United States. And they have very specific needs and strengths. So what I'm going to share today are not their differences, but what they have in common, what they share. Some of the experiences are shared, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. Next slide, please. So in order to talk about this population's experiences and needs, I'm going to talk about it in kind of four sections, 4 phases. The first is going to be the pre-migration and what happens pre-migration and in country of origin. Then what happens, what's their experience during their migration and their journey. And then what happens when they're apprehended at the border and they are detained. And then what happens when they're reunified or are released into the community, and what happens with the new life that they have once that happens. Next slide, please. So first, let's try to understand the context, what happens pre-migration. In many areas of the Northern Triangle, which, as I mentioned, is Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, gangs, or the maras, as they're known, have become the most present and powerful actors in most children's lives. So the vast majority of my patients, for example, both children and adults, they have all had some kind of interaction with the gangs, with the maras, either directly and personally, that like something happened to them, or to a family member, or to a friend, or they live in a neighborhood where they know exactly which is the house that is owned by the Mara, and they're able to recognize the members of the gang. And so it's insecurity, violence, and fleeing for survival have become the primary reason for migration. The authorities rarely take reports or conduct investigations or win convictions, and it's estimated that 95% of crimes go unpunished. So there's just a chronic state of lawlessness, and there's a lot of violence. And some people try to go somewhere else, to go to another town or another city to try to avoid the dangers, but often this doesn't really solve the problem because they are persecuted, or they continue being threatened even in other parts of their country. Next slide, please. So why are children and families coming? These are some of the most important reasons. Children are especially vulnerable to some of this. There's a lot of targeted violence and extortion. They call it the war tax. So people have to pay for security, which like it's an extortion. It doesn't. It just means that if they don't pay, there are going to be consequences. We see a lot of forced gang recruitment, particularly of children, both boys and girls. With girls, there's always, with boys too, but I would say more with girls. There's the added component of sexual violence, and threats related to them being in relationships, as many of them call it, with gang members, and so girls are like in extra danger, to call it in a way. There's a lot of abject poverty, social exclusion, and we also see a lot of cases of labor and sex trafficking. Next slide, please. So that was a very brief overview of why they migrate to the United States. Now we're going to talk. Those were some of the factors of why they, like the push from their country. These are some of the reasons of the pull to the United States. In some cases, this is a safe haven for them. Very often they get to reunify with their families. We have a lot of patients whose parents migrated a while ago. It can be 5, 10, 15 years. And now the children are coming here and they're reuniting with their biological parents. They also have more opportunities for education and just economic opportunities as a whole. So this is kind of an overview of why they come. Now we're going to talk about how they come. Next slide, please. So the journey is around 2,000 miles, and the methods of transportation include bus, walking, a lot of walking, car rides, and a train called La Bestia, or the train of death, where there's constant risk of falling off and mutilation. And these pictures that you just saw are of the train La Bestia. Next slide, please. The journey is frequently characterized by harsh and life-threatening experience. We often hear of all this listed here, and of sexual assault and robberies and exposure to the elements, extreme heat or extreme cold, kidnapping, both by competing drug cartels and by other groups. And it's often not them who decide to migrate. Sometimes the decision has been made for them, especially if they're younger kids. Sometimes they are told, tonight you are going away, and they don't really know why. The family may know of a threat, that their life is in danger, or they receive specific threats, and so they'll send the children without them really knowing why or what's happening. But sometimes they do know, and sometimes they are aware of the threats or the danger. And then when they cross, it can be with or without a smuggler or a coyote. Next slide, please. So after surviving all of what I mentioned, all of the violence and everything, some of them present at the port of entry in the United States, like at the border, and they express their fears of harm if they're returned to their home country. Many are simply turned away because they're told that there isn't like enough space, or that they're out of numbers for the day, or like for different reasons. So they have to stay and live in camps, in migrant camps, which are very often just plagued with violence and more threats, because there are groups and cartels who have control over most of the camps. So living in the camps is not a safe situation, especially for children or women. And so because of this, some get desperate or run out of money to survive at the border, and they decide to cross the border without inspection. Next slide, please. So when that happens, they come through the river and the desert. There is an estimated 500 deaths per year recorded by dehydration and or drowning crossing the border. So if they're lucky, they don't die. But this, like examples of things that patients have said about this crossing, is that they hear and feel animals in the middle of the night, that they are walking for days at a time. They see bones and dead bodies, like you would in a horror movie. They see dogs chasing either them or others, and all, regardless of age, usually say that they're terrified of the animals in the river. Next slide, please. And one more click. Thank you. They typically get apprehended right away, or they look for the border patrol, for La Migra, to turn themselves in. Not only because they will receive like water and food after the journey, but it can be very important for them to be apprehended so that there's a record that they arrived before they turned 18, because this is going to have legal implications later on, and I'm going to talk about that too. So it's both because of how they're feeling, or they may be sick, or they may be dehydrated, or very hungry, starved, and also to for there to be a record that they arrived before the age of 18. Next slide, please. So when they're apprehended, they're taken to these places called La Hielera, or icebox, and La Perrera, dog kennel, because of the freezing temperatures and because it looks like a dog kennel. This is the first place where they're going to be taken to after being apprehended. Children are initially in the same space with adults, and then they are separated. All patients consistently report that in addition to the freezing temperatures, there are bright lights on the ceiling and they stay on at all times. So it's difficult to differentiate night from day because it's always, the lights are always on. There are no windows. It's very hard to get any sleep. The floor is hard and cold. The cells are crowded. People have to use the toilet in front of others, so there's like no privacy. Children are crying and coughing all night long. Food is bad and scarce, and there's lack of medical care. Many of the examinations are conducted, like there is a medical examination, but I say that with huge quotation marks because many of the examinations are conducted by law enforcement officers rather than medical providers. And they're frequently limited to checking for lice, scabies, and chickenpox. And they usually stay here between 2 and 4 days before they're transferred. Next slide, please. Then they're taken to these processing centers, and it's here at the processing centers where they're going to have the first opportunity to explain why they are escaping. Why are they here? Why are they seeking asylum or protection, and why they can't return to their country? But very often, because of trauma, it's difficult for them to convey the story. It's very common that they don't trust authorities, especially authorities dressed in uniform. They're often scared of the information that they provide going back to their country of origin and endangering their family or their community. So they don't know who they can trust with what. Next slide, please. So they stay at the processing center also like around 2 to 3 days. And after that, children are transferred to this ORR shelters. ORR is the Office for Refugee Resettlement. And children are provided with dorm style rooms. They have shared bathrooms, showers, they have clothes, hot meals, year-round educational services, recreational activities, and limited legal services. They also receive medical and mental health care while in custody. And this shift is very important because the ORR shelters are part of Human and Health Services. So no longer part of the Department of Homeland Security. They're now part of Human and Health Services. And so there's a big shift in treatment in like preparation of the people that work there. They're no longer immigration authorities. So this is kind of this makes a very big difference when they're transferred to these shelters. And in these shelters they'll stay between 30 and 60 days, depending on different things. But they'll stay there while it is determined where the children are going to be sent to. So if they have a parent or they have a someone that's willing to take them in and to become responsible for them, they have to investigate that person and everybody that lives with that person. And so they take fingerprints and they run background checks and stuff like that to make sure that they're not releasing the child to someone who is going to be a danger to the child. Next slide, please. So 48% of children are released to their biological parent, or to their parent. Actually, I shouldn't say biological, to their parent. 23 to other adult relative, 50% to sibling. And siblings we see usually with children from Guatemala in particular. Others to non-relatives or to grandparents. And the child may have never met the sponsor before. It can be the friend of the grandfather who they saw twice when they were 3 years old. It doesn't have to be someone directly related to them, or even if it's a relative, it can be an aunt or an uncle that they've never met, or a father they've never met, or a mom that with whom they lived maybe for a few days and then they didn't see each other again. So, and this is going to play a part later on in the adaptation and adjustment of and how the relationship between child and sponsor goes. Next slide, please. Now, so after they're released, of course, it's like a new life begins. However, often people think that once this happens, everything is great and all the burden or the challenges are put to rest, and this is absolutely not the case. In the best case scenario, we have found that there's a honeymoon phase that lasts, in the best case, for 3 weeks. And this, I'm especially talking about children reuniting with their parents, with whom they grew up, at least for a little bit. So this is in the best scenario. So it's not people that they've never met, it's people that they have met, that they have some kind of relationship. And so there's a honeymoon phase when this happens. My child, I love you, I'm so happy we can finally be a family again, we can be together. And the child is, mom, I love you so much, I am so happy to finally be able to live with you and to be together. We're all going to be a family again and it's going to be wonderful. And this is great until the other stressors start coming up. Sometimes there are stressors already in the household, like the financial stress, food and housing insecurity. The caregivers may be fearful of being deported themselves. And the children often feel misunderstood, like they can't trust their parent or their sponsor, whether it's a parent or not. They can't trust their sponsor. Sometimes they get home and they are living with abusive caretakers. Very often they're not used to being parented or parented in such a close way. And because of the fears of the caretakers of getting in trouble, very often there are a lot of limitations on freedom. So they'll allow them to go from school to home and from home to school. And this is very different from the life that they used to have back home, in which they had much more freedom than that. So there are other stressors like legal. They have to find an attorney and go to their legal appointments. They have to adapt to a completely different lifestyle, from wearing different clothes to new weather, different food, different language, different rules and social rules. In schooling, they may be placed at a different level than they should. There may be gaps in their schooling, and even though there are some schools that are bilingual, not all schools are bilingual, and some of these children are placed in schools that are not bilingual. So they just come here to everything new, including having to study in a language they don't speak yet. Um, there's, as I mentioned, a lot of isolation, issues with discrimination. Both, like, some already come with that baggage from their country of origin, and then they have experiences with discrimination here as well. And then survivor's guilt, not necessarily for those who reunite with their parents, but for the rest, they often feel like they're the only hope for the family that was left back home, and that family depends on the money that they send. So they feel like they have to start working right away. And sometimes it's not just that they feel, but they are told by the family that stayed back home that they have to start working and send money right away. And they worry also about the family that stayed. And some have to start working right away because they have to repay the debt that helped them get here. Next slide, please. So those were some of the stressors for the children. Some of the stressors for the adults are this. There's a constant fear of deportation. And this I'm talking about the families that come together. Most of what I mentioned, except the shelters, is kind of the same process for asylum-seeking families and for unaccompanied children, except the part about the sponsor and the shelter. But it's true that it's a new life for both, like even for asylum-seeking families or for children. And these are some particular stressors for adults with children or asylum-seeking families. Often they come thinking that that they have supportive relationships that they end up not having. They're fearful of being deported themselves. They have to find lawyers. They don't have work authorization. We see a lot of labor exploitation, housing issues, language issues, stigma, as I mentioned, racism and discrimination, and they don't have insurance or healthcare. In New York City, many of our patients have emergency Medicaid, and so, but it's for emergencies, so that is also a stressor. Next slide, please. So both children and adults who are apprehended are placed in court proceedings to determine whether they are eligible to stay in the United States or not. But the burden is on them. They have to prove that they are eligible for the legal relief that they're seeking, which will allow them to lawfully stay in the United States. Most common forms of relief that we see are asylum, which is for people persecuted in their home country on the basis of their identity as part of a particular social group, and immigrant juvenile status, which is for children, particularly children, not adults, children who are abused, abandoned, or neglected by one or both parents, either in their country of origin or in the United States. We also see some cases in which the patients are eligible for a T visa, which is for people who have been trafficked, or U visa for children or adults who have been victims of crimes in the United States and they cooperate with the police investigation. They do not have the right to a government-appointed counsel, so they must represent themselves in court. And we know that legal representation matters a lot. It's much more likely that they will get granted asylum or the form of legal relief that they're seeking if they have legal representation. And then they're going to have between 5 and 10 court hearings over 2 to 4 years until a final outcome is reached. Next slide, please. So just to say, there are a lot of attorneys who do pro bono representation, but the need is always much, much, much larger than the services provided, unfortunately. Now, it's important to talk about the medical and mental health legal nexus, because both, like, people in mental health and in medical care can uncover and document key medical and mental health evidence. For example, document a bullet lodged in the spine or an intellectual disability, which may make a person a target for further persecution in their home country, making them a part of a particular social group, which is one of the criteria for asylum. Or we can uncover traumas that the attorney may not know of, that are can be crucial in their legal case. We can also improve their ability to testify in court, especially from the mental health perspective. We help them mentally and emotionally prepare for their hearings and to process their thoughts and their feelings both before and after their legal experiences. So because of this, it's very important to first learn to identify them. Next slide, please. These are some questions that can help you identify unaccompanied immigrant children, because I think it's very likely that you have already worked with with an unaccompanied immigrant child, because they have been released to every single state in the United States. So it is likely that you have already worked with one. And hopefully with this, you'll be able to identify them or feel more comfortable trying to identify one in the future. We know that we can find them in both healthcare and non-healthcare settings. And these are 4 questions that can be helpful in identifying them. Where were you born? How old were you when you came to the United States? Were you apprehended at the border? Were you with a parent or legal guardian? Next slide, please. So what do we do with all this information? Now I'm going to talk about the work that we do at Terra Firma, which is, as was mentioned before, a medical legal mental health partnership embedded at a community health center, which is a federally qualified health center called Montefiore Bronx Health Collective, which is part of the Montefiore system. Next slide, please. So these are some of our goals. We want our patients to have a home away from home, a place in which they feel respected, cared for, understood, where they feel like they belong and they matter. We want to improve their overall health and well-being, both from the medical perspective and from the mental health perspective. And the way that we do it is through the Terra Firma model. Next slide, please. These are the columns of the model, of the Terra Firma model. First is comprehensive primary care, which I'm going to talk a little more about in a second. We also have integrated mental health services, which I'm also going to talk about. Co-located pro bono legal services. So we're partnered with Catholic Charities to represent unaccompanied immigrant children, and with NILAC, New York Legal Assistance Group, to represent our families seeking asylum. And so before the pandemic, we used to have like a day at the clinic in which the attorneys could come here and the patients would come here to see their medical provider, their mental health provider, and their legal provider in the same place. That was like one of the beauties of the program, that it was co-located. With the pandemic, of course, things changed and we're not really co-located anymore. The medical and mental health part is co-located. Actually, that also is not completely true, because mental health is doing most of our work. We're doing still telehealth. But we do work in very tight coordination and communication with the mental health and medical providers. And we work very closely also with the legal providers, either from these 2 organizations and with other attorneys from other organizations. We also do provide social services and case management, from support with college applications to housing issues to distribution of food pantry and clothes and other basic needs during COVID. We provide affidavits and evaluations, mental health and medical, to help judges, immigration judges and asylum officers understand who they have in front of them, what things the person lived, what events they lived in their country of origin that made them migrate, like what's their trauma history that made them migrate, and how that trauma looks like in them now. Like, what are their symptoms? Do they have depression symptoms? Do they have PTSD symptoms? And what do they look in that person in particular? So if there's let's say a girl that presents with PTSD, and when she talks about her, let's say, sexual abuse history, she is laughing, I am, as a mental health provider, and writing the evaluation, I'm going to help the judge understand that when that happens, it doesn't mean that the girl is lying, that she didn't suffer from it, that she's making everything up. I'm going to help him explain, or her explain, understand that that is what trauma looks like on that particular person. I'm going to help explain what trauma looks like in general, but in that person in particular. We also do a lot of advocacy. We've presented in front of Congress, and we have collaborated with the ACLU in federal litigation. And we have an enrichment program, which includes tutoring, English classes, soccer, photography, field trips. And importantly, we consider this enrichment programming as a mental health intervention, because many complain of not having freedom, as I mentioned before, and being bored at home and having like a lack of activities. So we consider enrichment programming as a mental health intervention. Next slide, please. I often get asked the question of how they get to us. How do we get those patients, or how the patients get to us? And the answer is, number one is word of mouth. We work with many people from the same community, especially from the Garifuna community, which, for those of you who may not know this, the Garifuna community is an Afro-Caribbean community that is based mostly in Honduras, but there's also part in Guatemala. And so we see a lot of people from that community at our clinic. We also have referrals from our legal partners, both from Catholic Charities and NILAC, but also from other legal providers. Next slide, please. So this is related to the medical care that we provide. Many of our patients are primary care naive, so we introduce the concept of what a medical home is, and we try to be their medical home. So they come to us for everything medical, and because we're part of Montefiore Hospital, if there are like specialty services that they need, we may refer to other parts of the hospital as well, to other departments. These are some of the routine screens that are done: hearing, vision, developmental, newborn, sickle cell, and reproductive health. And these are some of the screenings that are done for new arrivals. Mental health screens are also used, and these are some of the resources used by the medical providers when working with these patients. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk for a second about the mental health part. There is very scarce research on this population in particular, but the research that does exist tells us that they have a higher exposure to physical and sexual abuse. There's a higher prevalence and severity of PTSD, depression, and anxiety, and that they have very high levels of functioning. There are no studies on the efficacy of treatments, but we do know that social stressors compound trauma. Next slide, please. So these are the mental health services that we offer. We provide individual psychotherapy, which includes, starts with a mental health assessment. We tend to immediate stressors and create a solid foundation. We help them process traumatic events and support their immigration process by writing these evaluations or affidavits in support, and then preparing them for court. And we do a lot of coordination with the attorneys, and we ourselves may testify in court as well. And that's true for the medical providers too. We do family psychotherapy and group psychotherapy. We used to have these 3 groups. Right now, because of COVID, they were stopped, but I think it's likely that we'll restart the preteen group in a couple of months. Next slide, please. These are some of the mental health difficulties that we see. I would say especially PTSD, complex trauma, and attachment reactions, and depression for sure. Next slide, please. So when you think about trauma, or when I think about trauma, it's important to think of it as a continuum of reactions. We have from internalizing, which is you're going to see the typical kid that is like socially withdrawn, isolated, has feelings of loneliness or guilt, or feeling unloved or sad, has somatic complaints, is nervous or irritable, and fearfulness. So internalizing, bringing everything, inside. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have the exact opposite, which looks like someone is being like rebellious or is acting out. someone that's losing their temper or being verbally or physically aggressive, alcohol and drug abuse, theft, etc. But we have to understand that two things. One, that there are a million of in-betweens, like these are the two extremes, but there are a lot of colors in the middle, and that the same person won't necessarily react the same way every single time. So they may react some way with a with a specific trigger, but they may react differently at a different time. And so providing trauma-informed care may mean a lot of things, but it starts with taking into consideration the mental health piece of the person, that the person that you have in front of you, their mental health, um, the way that they present is likely the result of their traumatic experiences and a way for them to cope with the trauma. So providing trauma-informed services means that you have to contextualize the behaviors as trauma responses, and the symptoms are explained as adaptive attempts to cope. Next slide, please. So these are some of the observations that we see in our patients, and that I encourage you to think of them next time that you have a person in front of you who has any of this. I encourage you to at least think this or the trauma reactions. I encourage you to give it a thought that maybe what you're seeing is a consequence of this, of trauma. And maybe you already do, of course, and that would be really great. We see a lot of difficulty with attachment, like negotiating and developing trusting relationships. Can I trust this person? Can I trust this nurse? Can I trust this medical provider? Can I trust this therapist? Like, who are they? Are they gonna share what I tell them? Are they gonna keep confidentiality? Are they gonna judge me? Are they gonna understand where I'm coming from? And when I tell them things, are they gonna believe me or not? They have difficulty with attention and concentration and with recall. Sometimes they won't remember things that you would think, like, how can you not remember that? No, they really may not remember. And that's part of how trauma shows up in them. They may have little or no elaboration of narrative, or it may not be organized, so that if you ask them something, they may start from the end and then go back to the middle, and then just it won't be organized. And that is just a very clear reflection of trauma. And then you also have the behavior and affect incongruent. As I mentioned, the girl who was telling a trauma story while laughing or giggling. There's some incongruency there. And then you have the behavioral indicators: fidgety, restless, no eye contact, rapid breathing, fast talk, being tangential. Next slide, please. So these are some of the things that I also encourage you to think about when trying to provide trauma-informed services. You want to focus on safety and minimizing re-traumatization as much as possible. Focus on the relationship that you may develop with this person, being warm and focusing on the trust, like developing trust and emotional connection, providing culturally congruent services, promoting agency and control, destigmatizing their symptoms. Sometimes it's so helpful for them to hear just some validation of what they're saying, a validation in the sense that somebody understands that this is coming from something that happened to them. It's not that there's something wrong with them. Ask questions sensitively, and just the most basic and important thing is just be patient and empathic and nice. I think that goes a really, really, really long way. Next slide, please. And lastly, I just want to say that this population is, some of these kids and these families are one of the most resilient people I've met in my entire life. There's this theory that's called the migration of the fittest by Escobar, that says that unaccompanied children who leave their home countries and successfully complete their journey to the United States may differ with regard to both internal resourcefulness and external support compared to children who remained in their countries of origin who didn't successfully complete the trip north. This is the children that left their countries and survived the journey and are here and you're going to meet throughout your career are already more resilient than both their peers in their home country that didn't attempt the journey and those who did attempt it and didn't survive it. So this population is extremely, extremely resilient. And just to remember also that they have this resiliency approach, that the population tends to identify with narratives of strength through adversity rather than with the victimization. So I think this is very important when working with this population as well. Next slide, please. That was the last slide. Okay. Thank you. I want to leave some time for questions, comments,
Sure.
complaints.
Thank you so much, Brenda. That was very informative, and you gave us so much information about caring for unaccompanied immigrant children. And I think we have a few questions for you. One of the main ones is you focus just mainly on children from the southwest border. I think you described it, like South America and those countries. So I'm not sure, does your organization care for other children from other immigrant countries, maybe like the Caribbean, or even now we know we have a lot of people maybe coming from the Ukraine or other European countries?
Yes. So yes, we're open to unaccompanied immigrant children as a whole. The ones that we see the most are a reflection of the ones that of the communities that migrate the most, I would say. And so it's interesting. There's a website from the Department of Homeland Security in which one can see exactly how many unaccompanied children came from each country. But the ones that they have the most, the numbers are the highest, are from these countries from Central America, from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. But we also see, for example, children from Mexico, even though that it's much less because they get deported much more easily
Mm,
than those from Central America. We also have many from Ecuador, for example. We have some from Dominican Republic. We're now starting to see from Cuba, but we also have from West African countries, for example, from Ghana. I know that we have a few. To my knowledge, I don't think we have seen from the Ukraine yet, but we definitely may. So we're not restricted to specific countries. It's just like the it has to do with the number of unaccompanied children who migrate to the United States from these different countries, but also where they end up. We see all of the ones that we see, they live in New York, in New York City in particular.
right. Okay.
So we're not close to others. It's just the ones that
Right.
end up here.
That makes sense. And then how do you handle the healthcare needs for children who may have a medical condition with that may need a genetic medical condition, or that may need family background, biological family background, if there's no biological family for the child, to review, no biological family history. How do you handle caring for those children?
That is a very good question, and a big challenge too. When possible, we may contact the family in the country of origin when that's possible, but sometimes it's not possible because the families live in places that may not have the services, or it may be difficult to reach the families. But when it's possible, we may reach out to the families that may have this information in country of origin. Or we also work with, let's say, if the sponsor is a relative, they may be able also to contact whoever it is in the country of origin that may provide that information, or another relative that may have the information that may know, yes, our uncle had this condition. And
Okay. And do you find any particular regional differences in maybe healthcare needs, or even mental health care needs in children based on maybe the countries they're from, or specific areas that may be going through different things? Do you find anything like that that you might be able to share with the healthcare professionals on today? So if there are any things to look out for about children maybe from one area over another?
that is a very good question. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of things that differentiate them. like age. For example, what I mentioned about the children from Guatemala, that they usually reunite with older siblings and
Mhm.
not with parents, for example. But I think uh, no, I think they mostly, like, the experiences that we have learned from them are shared experiences, especially the part about the violence with the gangs. We know that that is very similar in El Salvador, in Guatemala, in Honduras. Like, people are very scared of these gangs and things happening. And in that sense, that works pretty similar in the three countries. And another thing is that in the three countries, there is a high rate of um, primary care. I don't know if to call it naivete, but like, there's a lot of people who haven't been to the doctor in a really, really long time, or that haven't gotten their vaccinations, like the very
Mhm.
basic vaccinations that children here get. In terms of mental health, for example, we know that there's a lot of stigma, but it's not per country. I would say that's per region. Like, I would say, uh, yeah, there's stigma in most of the countries that we work with. That's part of the work that we do, like the stigmatizing
Mhm.
mental health services.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good to know. And we really appreciate you taking the time out to share this information with us today. And we'll wrap up here. We are coming up on the hour. So thank you so much. We do definitely have this information available. As I mentioned, the webinar was recorded today and it will be posted in our media library. We have one of our participants saying thank you so much for this presentation. So we definitely do appreciate you taking the time. And as I mentioned to our participants that joined us today, all of our attendees, you will receive information on the CNE credits. We do have one last question that just popped in. Is the stigma from the children or from the sponsors?
That's an excellent question, and I unfortunately have to report that it's from both, because
Mhm.
there is often this stigma that mental health is for crazy people, and so um, we know that it's not. But children learn what they hear from the adults,
Mhm.
and so I think it's kind of from both. But
Mhm.
fortunately, we like when that is the case, I often encourage them to try it out for a couple of sessions, and we always say, like, we're never going to force you to anything. Just try it out, and if you don't like it, we don't have to do it again.
Mhm. Right.
And so that helps destigmatize a little bit.
Thank you so much. I think that's great because I think that's something that applies to children in general. They do remember and, view and repeat what they hear and what they see. So any culture, any age, that's just natural with children. So that makes sense. Thank you so much again for sharing with us today. Again, this was very informative, and thank you all for participating with us today, and look out for our next webinar series.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for being here today.
Thank you. All right. Have a great day.
Thank you too. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.